Operation Mincemeat ended before the invasion of Sicily truly began. April 1943. British intelligence released a dead body into the Atlantic, carrying documents that described an invasion that would never happen. Nazi Germany read those papers, accepted them as genuine, and redirected its forces away from Sicily. When Allied troops landed, resistance was far weaker than expected. The result reshaped the Mediterranean campaign. But this outcome raises uncomfortable questions. Why did one of the most suspicious intelligence systems in modern warfare trust documents retrieved from a corpse? Why did German command act on this information instead of its own strategic logic? And why did British planners choose a method that could collapse entirely if a single assumption proved false? This was not a clever trick layered onto a solid plan. It was a strategy built on psychological pressure, bureaucratic habits, and a dangerous bet on how an enemy prefers to think. This episode is not about how Operation Mincemeat was executed. It is about why such a plan was even allowed to exist. In early 1943, British command faced a strategic dilemma with no clean solution. Sicily was the logical target for an Allied invasion, but it was also the obvious one. German planners expected it. Reinforcements were already positioned. A conventional assault risked turning the invasion into a costly grind before the campaign had truly begun. The problem was not tactical surprise. It was predictability. British leadership needed Germany to believe something that contradicted logic, yet felt strategically reasonable from Berlin's point of view. That meant abandoning standard deception doctrine. No layered redundancy. No gradual conditioning. No controlled leaks across multiple channels. Operation Mincemeat was unorthodox because it concentrated all credibility into a single object, a single narrative, and a single moment of interpretation. If the enemy rejected it, there would be no correction. No second chance. This was not a deception designed to confuse. It was a deception designed to convince. And to understand why British command accepted that risk, we first need to understand the strategic environment that made every conventional option insufficient. Because it was inside those constraints, geographic, political, and psychological, that an idea this extreme began to look rational. To understand why Operation Mincemeat was even considered, we need to step away from the corpse, the documents, and the cleverness of the ruse, and look at the strategic map Britain was facing in early 1943. At the highest level, the situation looked deceptively simple. The Allies needed a foothold in southern Europe. Sicily sat in the middle of the Mediterranean, controlling sea lanes, airfields, and access to mainland Italy. Capturing it would fracture Axis logistics and apply direct pressure on Mussolini's regime. That logic was obvious. And that was precisely the problem. German high command expected Sicily to be the next move. Any competent strategist would. It was the shortest route, the most operationally sensible target, and the one Allied planners could justify politically to Washington and London. Sicily was not just likely. It was inevitable. Which meant surprise, in the traditional sense, was already gone. From Britain's perspective, the Mediterranean theater was constrained on multiple levels at once. Geographically, Sicily favored the defender. Mountainous terrain limited maneuver. Narrow beaches restricted landing options. Axis airfields in Italy and southern France could strike invading forces quickly. Any delay during the landings would compound losses. Logistically, Allied resources were stretched thin. The build-up for a cross-channel invasion was already consuming men, ships, and political attention. The Mediterranean campaign could not afford a prolonged stalemate. It needed momentum. A costly victory in Sicily would undermine broader strategic timelines. Politically, the alliance itself imposed limits. British planners could not unilaterally delay or cancel the invasion without consequences. American leadership was impatient for visible progress. A plan that looked overly cautious or indirect risked losing support at the highest levels. Time was not neutral. Every month strengthened German defenses in Western Europe. Every delay made future operations harder. Under these pressures, the strategic question was not, should we take Sicily? It was, how do we take Sicily without paying the full price of its predictability? This is where German blind spots become critical. German intelligence in 1943 was not incompetent. But it was shaped by assumptions hardened through previous campaigns. The Wehrmacht expected its enemies to behave rationally, efficiently, and in accordance with established military logic. That expectation worked, until it didn't. Berlin viewed the Mediterranean through a specific lens. They feared an Allied thrust into the Balkans. Greece, Yugoslavia, and the Aegean were politically volatile. German control there relied on fragile occupation structures and limited forces. A serious Allied move in that direction could destabilize the entire southeastern flank. At the same time, German command believed Sicily was defensible. Strong garrisons. Short reinforcement lines. Interior lines of movement. From their perspective, Sicily was dangerous, but manageable. This produced a strategic tension inside German planning. They expected Sicily to be attacked, but they worried more about being wrong elsewhere. That tension mattered. British intelligence did not need Germany to ignore Sicily. They needed Germany to hesitate. They needed German planners to believe that Sicily was still likely, but not imminent. That another operation, riskier and more politically disruptive, might come first. This is a subtle but crucial distinction. Mincemeat was never meant to erase Sicily from German thinking. It was meant to reorder priorities. And the strategic environment made that reordering plausible. Spain's neutrality created another opening. German intelligence regularly monitored Spanish channels. Documents passing through Spain were not immediately dismissed, but they were also not fully trusted. That ambiguity was valuable. It created space for interpretation rather than immediate rejection. Meanwhile, German intelligence culture rewarded confirmation. Information that fit existing concerns moved faster. Information that contradicted them required justification. British planners understood this dynamic. They did not aim to overwhelm German intelligence with evidence. They aimed to give it something it already wanted to believe, wrapped in just enough realism to survive scrutiny. At this stage, however, no decision had been made. The idea of using a dead body to deliver false plans still sat far outside conventional doctrine. It violated multiple principles of intelligence tradecraft. It relied on too many variables beyond British control. Most professional officers would have dismissed it outright. But as constraints tightened, conventional alternatives began to collapse under their own weight. A traditional deception campaign would take time Britain did not have. A multi-channel misinformation effort risked leaks that could expose the entire invasion. A purely tactical feint would not move German divisions far enough or long enough. The strategic map was closing in. And inside that narrowing space, British command faced a paradox. The safer the plan, the less likely it was to work. The riskier the plan, the more decisive its effect, if it succeeded. It was within this paradox, not cleverness or bravado, that Operation Mincemeat began to look less absurd, and more necessary. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It favors redundancy, layered verification, and plans that degrade gracefully when something goes wrong. In early 1943, British planners knew exactly what doctrine prescribed for a situation like Sicily. A conventional approach would look disciplined, cautious, and defensible on paper. First, soften the target. Sustained bombing to degrade airfields, ports, and infrastructure. Then apply deception in familiar forms, radio traffic, visible troop movements, controlled leaks through diplomatic channels. Finally, land with overwhelming force and accept that resistance would be heavy but manageable. This method had worked before. It had logic. And it had one fatal flaw. It assumed time was available. Every doctrinal option required weeks or months of preparation. Each additional layer of deception increased exposure. Each delay allowed German engineers to reinforce defenses and reposition reserves. The longer Britain followed the rulebook, the more predictable the invasion became. Doctrine also assumed that the enemy would respond proportionally. That German command would weigh evidence carefully, test contradictions, and wait for confirmation before acting decisively. But this assumption ignored the internal pressure shaping German decision-making. German command was not operating in a calm analytical environment. It was reacting to threats on multiple fronts, political anxiety in occupied territories, and Hitler's personal fixation on strategic surprise. Under these conditions, doctrine's emphasis on patience and verification began to break down. From London's perspective, this created a contradiction. If Britain followed doctrine, Germany would have time to adapt. If Britain deviated slightly, Germany would notice the deviation. If Britain deviated radically, Germany might misinterpret it as authenticity. Doctrine did not account for this asymmetry. Most deception strategies rely on accumulation. Mincemeat relied on compression. Instead of many weak signals over time, it proposed a single, dense signal delivered at exactly the right moment. Instead of confusing the enemy, it aimed to anchor their interpretation around a coherent story. This violated a core principle of intelligence work: never let one data point decide everything. Under normal circumstances, that principle is correct. But in early 1943, normal circumstances no longer applied. Any traditional feint toward Greece or Sardinia would be easy to dismiss. German intelligence had seen such moves before. Repetition breeds skepticism. Familiarity dulls impact. A dead officer, however, changed the equation. Doctrine treated information as abstract. Mincemeat treated information as human. Letters. Receipts. Personal details. A life that looked real enough to die for its paperwork. This was not how intelligence was supposed to work. It blurred the line between analysis and emotion, between data and narrative. That blur was precisely what doctrine could not handle. A conventional officer would object immediately. Too many variables. Too much reliance on enemy error. No way to intervene once the process began. All valid criticisms. But each criticism carried an implicit assumption that a safer plan existed. By early 1943, British command was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. There was no safe plan left. Only plans with different failure modes. Doctrine offered a controlled failure. Mincemeat offered a catastrophic failure, or a decisive success. This is where the logic shifted. The question was no longer, is this plan sound? It became, is this plan more dangerous than doing nothing different? And that question did not have a doctrinal answer. Because doctrine could explain how to invade Sicily, but it could not explain how to make Germany look away long enough for the invasion to matter. By the time Operation Mincemeat became a serious proposal, British command was no longer debating creativity. They were debating responsibility. Ideas like this do not emerge in moments of confidence. They surface when every conventional option has already been examined, revised, and found wanting. The core concept did not arrive fully formed. It evolved through internal pressure, skepticism, and quiet calculation. At every stage, the same question returned in different forms. Who is willing to authorize a plan that cannot be corrected once it begins? This was not a technical debate. It was an institutional one. British intelligence culture valued discretion, but it also valued plausibility. A deception operation could fail quietly. Mincemeat could not. If German intelligence identified the ruse, the exposure would not remain local. It would radiate outward, contaminating future operations and discrediting British tradecraft. That risk framed every internal discussion. Supporters of the plan understood exactly what they were proposing. They were not arguing that the operation was safe. They were arguing that its danger was the point. The first assumption was brutally simple. German intelligence would recover the body. Not might. Would. If the body sank, washed ashore in the wrong place, or was ignored by local authorities, the operation failed silently. There would be no signal, no feedback, no chance to adapt. Months of preparation would evaporate without consequence or reward. This assumption alone disqualified the plan in most professional environments. The second assumption was even more fragile. That German intelligence would treat the documents as genuine because they appeared authentic in form, context, and human detail. Not because they were flawless, but because they were inconvenient to doubt. The documents were designed to feel accidental. Not planted. Not polished. Not theatrical. They contained minor inconsistencies, casual language, and bureaucratic imperfections. These were not errors. They were calculated risks. Perfect documents invite suspicion. Imperfect ones invite belief. This logic ran counter to standard intelligence thinking. Normally, planners try to eliminate ambiguity. Here, ambiguity was used as camouflage. The third assumption was the most dangerous. That German command would act on the information without full verification. This assumption did not rely on German incompetence. It relied on German pressure. British analysts believed that Berlin's fear of being strategically surprised would outweigh its instinct to delay. Faced with a plausible threat to Greece and Sardinia, German planners would feel compelled to move forces, if only to avoid being blamed later for inaction. This was a psychological bet, not an analytical one. Inside British command, opposition focused on this point. What if German intelligence suspected the ruse but acted anyway, using it to mask their true intentions? What if they reinforced Greece without weakening Sicily? What if they waited just long enough to see whether the threat materialized? There were no answers. Only probabilities. And then there was the question no one wanted to articulate directly. What if this works too well? If Mincemeat succeeded, it would validate a method that should not become doctrine. It would encourage future planners to rely on enemy misjudgment rather than controllable force. It would reward a mindset that confuses audacity with strategy. Success, in this case, carried its own long-term risk. Approval required a specific kind of authority. Not rank alone, but insulation. The individuals who allowed the operation to proceed understood that success would be anonymous. Failure would not be. There would be no public explanation, no opportunity to clarify intent. The record would simply show a catastrophic misjudgment. This created a quiet but powerful filter. Only those with sufficient institutional protection, and sufficient tolerance for personal risk, could endorse the plan. Not because they believed it was brilliant, but because they believed it was necessary. At its core, Mincemeat was not a deception aimed at German troops. It was aimed at German decision-makers. It targeted the structure of command itself. The operation sought to exploit how information moved upward in the German system. Local intelligence officers would encounter the documents. Mid-level analysts would assess them. Senior commanders would contextualize them within existing fears. At each level, the story became harder to challenge. By the time the information reached the top, rejecting it would require not just skepticism, but an alternative explanation that felt equally plausible. British planners understood this escalation effect. Once the story entered the system, it would gain momentum simply by being processed. This was the strategic insight that allowed the plan to survive internal opposition. Mincemeat did not need to convince everyone. It needed to survive each layer long enough to reach the one that mattered most. That insight reframed the debate. The operation was no longer judged as a single gamble. It was judged as a sequence of constrained decisions, each one rational in isolation, dangerous in combination. By approving the plan, British command accepted a fundamental inversion of control. They would initiate the action, then surrender agency entirely. From that point on, the outcome would depend on weather, bureaucracy, psychology, and enemy choice. This was not confidence. It was calculated resignation. They were not asking, will this work? They were asking, can we afford not to try? Once that question was answered, the decision became inevitable. Because the moment British command accepted that doctrine could not solve this problem, the only thing left was to test whether the enemy's assumptions were more rigid than their own. Once Operation Mincemeat moved from approval to execution, the nature of risk changed. Strategic risk became mechanical risk. Abstract assumptions had to survive contact with reality. This phase exposed the most fragile truth about the operation. The strategy itself was elegant, but its execution depended on dozens of small, unforgiving details. Any one of them could collapse the entire structure without warning. The first problem was not deception. It was logistics. A body had to exist. It had to be recent enough to appear plausible. Its condition had to align with a death at sea, not an artificial placement. And it had to withstand scrutiny by professionals trained to look for anomalies. This immediately created an ethical and operational boundary. The individual could not be a casualty of combat. That would introduce witnesses, records, and contradictions. The body needed to belong to someone who would not be missed, whose absence would not raise questions, and whose background could be plausibly erased and replaced. This was not incidental. It was a prerequisite. From that moment on, the operation stopped resembling conventional intelligence work. It became a form of logistical theater, except the audience would be hostile, suspicious, and highly trained. Next came the construction of identity. William Martin was not designed to be impressive. He was designed to be unremarkable. Rank mattered. Too senior, and the documents would seem irresponsible. Too junior, and they would lack strategic weight. His personal effects had to tell a story that made sense to a board clerk as much as to a senior analyst. Letters that sounded informal. Receipts that suggested routine movement. Minor imperfections that implied authenticity rather than carelessness. This process consumed time and attention that doctrine rarely accounts for. Not because it was complex, but because it required restraint. Every added detail risked over-engineering the narrative. Every removed detail risked leaving a gap. The planners were not trying to prove the documents were real. They were trying to avoid proving they were fake. At this stage, the operation entered its most dangerous phase, irreversible commitment. Once the body was released, British control ended. Weather became an actor. Ocean currents became variables. Local authorities became gatekeepers. No intelligence officer could influence what happened next. The selection of Spain as the recovery zone was calculated, but not controllable. Spanish neutrality was ambiguous by design. Spanish officials cooperated with both sides in different ways, often inconsistently. That inconsistency was useful, but also unpredictable. If the body washed ashore in the wrong location, it might never reach German hands. If Spanish authorities handled it too carefully, forensic inconsistencies could surface. If they dismissed it as irrelevant, the operation would die quietly. This was the first collapse point. The second collapse point involved timing. The documents had to arrive early enough to influence German planning, but not so early that verification mechanisms could disprove them before the invasion. This window was narrow. Days mattered. Delays mattered. Too early, and German intelligence could cross-check troop movements and notice inconsistencies. Too late, and German command would lack the time to reposition forces meaningfully. This meant the operation had to synchronize with Allied invasion preparations without revealing them. That synchronization was a risk multiplier. Every adjustment to invasion logistics increased the chance of contradiction. If German intelligence noticed that shipping patterns did not align with the alleged plans, suspicion could form retroactively. Mincemeat required silence not just in intelligence channels, but across the entire military apparatus. The third collapse point was human interpretation. The documents were not read in isolation. They entered a bureaucratic ecosystem. Spanish officials read them first. Then German intelligence officers. Then analysts. Then commanders. At each level, interpretation could diverge. A skeptical junior officer could flag anomalies. A cautious analyst could delay forwarding the information. A senior commander could dismiss it as misdirection. The plan did not need universal belief. But it needed momentum. This is where the operation's design revealed its most subtle feature. The documents were structured to create urgency without alarm. They suggested future action, not immediate crisis. They implied coordination problems, not operational brilliance. They presented the information as something not meant to be found, rather than something carefully placed. This framing mattered. Information that appears accidental often bypasses defensive skepticism. It is processed as background rather than signal. German intelligence was trained to interrogate signals. Background slipped through more easily. Still, the risk remained acute. One misstep could reverse the effect entirely. If German intelligence suspected the documents were planted, the deception could backfire catastrophically. Germany might reinforce Sicily even more heavily. Or worse, they might assume every subsequent Allied move was a ruse. At this stage, British planners could do nothing but wait. This waiting carried its own psychological toll. There were no updates. No confirmation. No reassurance. The operation did not provide feedback loops. Silence could mean success, or failure. This is rarely discussed in post-war accounts. Intelligence operations are often remembered as chains of clever decisions. In reality, they involve long stretches of uncertainty where decision-makers are forced to sit with outcomes they can no longer influence. Mincemeat was one of those cases. Then came the micro-twists. Spanish handling of the body introduced delays. Documents were copied. Returned. Passed along indirectly. Each step added uncertainty. Each delay threatened relevance. British intelligence could not intervene. Any attempt to accelerate the process risked exposure. The operation depended on appearing unimportant. This was another inversion of standard practice. Normally, intelligence officers fight for attention. Here, attention was the enemy. The longer the documents circulated without dramatic reaction, the more credible they became. Immediate alarm would have suggested manipulation. Gradual acceptance suggested authenticity. But gradual acceptance also risked irrelevance. This balancing act was never under full control. At its most fragile point, Operation Mincemeat existed in a state of strategic limbo. The documents were out of British hands, but not yet inside German decision-making. The invasion clock was ticking. The margin for influence was shrinking. At any moment, the operation could fail quietly, without drama, without exposure, without consequence. That possibility was built into the plan. British command had accepted that outcome from the beginning. What they could not accept was exposure. Quiet failure was survivable. Public failure was not. And this distinction shaped every execution choice. Nothing about mincemeat was optimized for certainty. It was optimized for plausibility under indifference. That is what made it dangerous. Because once German command finally engaged with the information, the operation would no longer be a British strategy. It would become a German decision. At that moment, control would shift completely. And whether the deception succeeded or collapsed would depend not on the brilliance of its design, but on how the enemy system processed doubt. Which brings us to the most decisive phase of the operation, not what Britain did next, but how Germany chose to respond. When the documents from Operation Mincemeat entered German intelligence channels, the operation crossed its final threshold. From this point on, British planning no longer mattered. Only German interpretation did. This is where most popular retellings simplify the story. They describe German command as careless, gullible, or overly confident. That explanation is convenient and incomplete. The more uncomfortable truth is that German intelligence reacted rationally, given its internal constraints. The documents did not arrive as a revelation. They arrived as confirmation. German planners were already concerned about Allied intentions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece, the Aegean, and the Balkans represented political instability, vulnerable supply lines, and occupation forces stretched thin. An Allied move there would not just be militarily inconvenient, it would be strategically humiliating. Against that background, the documents from Major William Martin fit cleanly. They did not introduce a new fear. They sharpened an existing one. This distinction matters. Intelligence that aligns with prior anxiety moves faster through institutions. It encounters less resistance. Each level of review assumes the previous level has already filtered out the obvious flaws. The first German analysts to review the material were not deciding whether the documents were real. They were deciding whether the documents were useful. This is a critical shift in perspective. In high-pressure systems, information is often judged by its actionability before its certainty. The question becomes, if this is true, what must we do now, rather than, is this definitively true? German command culture reinforced this tendency. Decision-making authority was centralized. Initiative was constrained. Delaying action carried personal risk. Acting on plausible intelligence, even if incomplete, was often safer than being blamed later for ignoring a warning. Operation Mincemeat exploited this asymmetry perfectly. If German command acted on the documents and they proved false, the error could be framed as reasonable caution. If they ignored the documents and an Allied landing occurred in Greece, the failure would be catastrophic and personal. This imbalance shaped behavior more than any single piece of evidence. Another factor amplified the effect: institutional compartmentalization. Different branches of German intelligence held partial information. No single analyst saw the entire picture. Some noticed inconsistencies. Others emphasized corroborating signals. But the system lacked an efficient mechanism to resolve these contradictions decisively. In theory, skepticism should have slowed the response. In practice, it fragmented it. While analysts debated details, planners focused on outcomes. They did not need total confidence to justify reinforcement. They needed only enough doubt about Sicily's priority. This is where the strategic break occurred. German command did not abandon Sicily. They rebalanced. For Britain, that was sufficient. Troops and resources were shifted toward Greece and Sardinia. Defensive attention was diluted. Reserve flexibility was reduced. The margin of error for Sicily's defense narrowed. From a German perspective, this was not irrational. It was hedging. The documents did not override doctrine. They nudged it. This is often misunderstood. Mincemeat did not convince Germany that Sicily was safe. It convinced Germany that Sicily could wait. That distinction explains why the deception succeeded without total belief. There is evidence that some German officers remained skeptical. But skepticism did not translate into inaction. The system rewarded visible precaution more than quiet doubt. Another subtle failure occurred at the level of narrative control. Once the documents were accepted as likely genuine, they became part of the internal story German command told itself about the war. Subsequent information was interpreted in light of that story. Signals that aligned with it were amplified. Signals that contradicted it were discounted. This is not unique to Germany. It is a universal feature of complex organizations under stress. Operation Mincemeat did not create this bias. It exploited it. At this stage, the operation reached its point of no return. British intelligence could not confirm success in real time. They had no direct visibility into German deliberations. They could only infer outcomes through indirect indicators, troop movements, intercepted communications, shifts in defensive posture. Each indicator suggested that the deception was working, but none provided certainty. This uncertainty persisted until Allied forces landed in Sicily. Only then did the full effect become visible. Resistance was lighter than anticipated. German reserves were not positioned for immediate counterattack. The window of opportunity had opened. From a strategic standpoint, this confirmed the operation's success. From an analytical standpoint, it raised deeper questions. Did the documents cause the German response, or merely accelerate a decision that was already being considered? Would German command have shifted resources anyway? Was the deception decisive, or marginal? These questions matter because they define how we interpret the operation's legacy. If Mincemeat succeeded because Germany wanted to believe it, then its applicability is limited. If it succeeded because of superior design, then it becomes a model. The evidence suggests an uncomfortable middle ground. The operation worked because it intersected with German fears at the right moment, under the right pressure, within a rigid decision-making system. Change any one of those variables, and the outcome becomes uncertain. This leads us to the final phase of analysis. Success came, but not without cost. That cost is often obscured by the elegance of the deception. To understand Operation Mincemeat fully, we must examine not just what it achieved, but what it consumed, exposed, and risked in the process. By the time Allied forces landed in Sicily, the strategic effects of Operation Mincemeat were already locked in. German dispositions were not optimal. Reserves were misaligned. Defensive depth was thinner than it should have been. The invasion succeeded faster, and with less resistance, than planners had feared. That is the result history remembers. But results alone do not define a strategy. They only obscure its cost. At the operational level, Mincemeat delivered what it promised. It reduced pressure on the landing forces. It bought time. It lowered the immediate human toll of a contested assault. These effects were real, measurable, and significant. Yet none of them were guaranteed. The operation's success rested on assumptions that could not be stress-tested beforehand. British command accepted this because the alternative, a predictable, heavily contested invasion, promised certainty of loss rather than the risk of it. This is the first cost, strategic exposure. Had the deception been uncovered, the damage would not have been limited to Sicily. It would have compromised British credibility across the entire intelligence domain. Future deceptions would have faced deeper skepticism. Genuine intelligence might have been dismissed as manipulation. In that sense, Mincemeat placed Britain's informational capital at risk, not just a single operation. The second cost was human, and it remains uncomfortable. A real person was used as a delivery mechanism. His body became an instrument of war. His identity was overwritten. His death was retroactively assigned strategic purpose. This was not incidental cruelty. It was operational necessity, as defined by those planning the war. No consent was possible. No recognition followed. The success of the operation required that this individual remain anonymous, absorbed into a fictional persona and then erased again. Strategically, this cost is easy to justify. Ethically, it resists closure. The third cost was psychological, borne by the decision-makers themselves. Those who authorized Mincemeat did so knowing that failure would be theirs alone. There was no doctrine to shield them. No precedent to cite. No higher authority to diffuse responsibility. During the execution phase, they lived with extended uncertainty. They could not intervene. They could not adjust. They could only wait and interpret silence. This kind of pressure does not appear in after-action reports. But it shapes how decisions are made, and how future risks are evaluated. There was also a hidden institutional cost. Success validated a method that should not be routine. It blurred the line between strategic insight and enemy error. It risked teaching the wrong lesson, that boldness can substitute for structural advantage. In the years that followed, deception operations inspired by Mincemeat did not always succeed. Some failed precisely because planners assumed that the enemy would behave as Germany did in 1943. They did not. Which brings us to the final counterfactual that must be addressed. What if Mincemeat had failed? Failure would not have looked dramatic. There would have been no exposure, no public embarrassment. The body might have been ignored. The documents might have been quietly dismissed. German forces would have remained concentrated. The invasion would still have gone ahead, just under far worse conditions. In that scenario, Mincemeat would not be remembered as reckless genius. It would be remembered, if at all, as an irrelevant curiosity. A strange idea that changed nothing. This is what makes evaluating the operation difficult. Its success magnifies its intelligence. Its failure would have erased it from serious consideration. That asymmetry complicates historical judgment. Operation Mincemeat did not remove risk from the war. It redistributed it, from soldiers on the beach to planners in offices, from predictable losses to unpredictable outcomes. Whether that trade was justified depends on what one believes strategy is supposed to optimize. Certainty, or consequence. And that question cannot be answered without stepping back from the details and confronting what this operation truly represents. Because beyond the corpse, beyond the documents, and beyond the invasion itself, Operation Mincemeat forces us to ask what kind of thinking modern warfare ultimately rewards. Operation Mincemeat is often described as a triumph of deception. That description is accurate, but incomplete. At its core, Mincemeat was not about hiding the truth. It was about reshaping decision space. British planners did not attempt to control German behavior. They accepted that control was impossible. Instead, they focused on constraining the range of German responses by altering what seemed reasonable inside Berlin's strategic imagination. This is the first principle the operation exposes. Strategy does not need certainty. It needs direction. Mincemeat did not require Germany to believe every detail. It required German command to feel uncertain enough, in the right direction, at the right moment. That uncertainty had to be uncomfortable. It had to demand action. And it had to make inaction feel riskier than movement. This breaks a foundational assumption of military planning, that clarity is always superior to ambiguity. In reality, ambiguity can be weaponized if it aligns with institutional fear. The second principle is more unsettling. The enemy's system matters more than the enemy's intelligence. Operation Mincemeat succeeded not because German officers were foolish, but because German command structures processed information in predictable ways. Authority was centralized. Responsibility flowed upward. Fear flowed downward. Within such systems, plausible warnings carry more weight than disproven threats. Acting, just in case, is rewarded. Waiting for certainty is punished. British planners did not exploit ignorance. They exploited incentives. This is why the operation cannot be reduced to cleverness. Cleverness alone does not move divisions. Institutional pressure does. The third principle is the most dangerous. Some strategies work precisely because they should not be repeated. Mincemeat succeeded because it was rare, context-specific, and misaligned with normal expectations. It arrived at a moment when German command was primed to overcorrect, when Allied intentions were predictable, and when alternative explanations were weak. Once such a method becomes known, or worse, admired, it loses its power. This is where many later interpretations fail. They treat mincemeat as a template. It was not. It was an exception made viable by a unique convergence of fear, timing, and structural rigidity. Remove any one of those factors, and the same strategy becomes reckless rather than brilliant. This is why Operation Mincemeat resists clean moral or doctrinal classification. It was not a model of how to deceive. It was a demonstration of how fragile large decision-making systems can become under pressure. And that fragility is not limited to World War II. Modern militaries still operate through layered hierarchies. Intelligence still moves through filters shaped by fear, responsibility, and institutional memory. Decisions are still made under incomplete information, with personal risk unevenly distributed. In that sense, mincemeat is not a historical curiosity. It is a warning. It shows how easily rational actors can be guided into suboptimal decisions without ever being fooled, in the simple sense. It shows how strategy can succeed without dominating the battlefield, by dominating the conversation inside the enemy's headquarters. But it also shows the cost of such thinking. When success depends on enemy error, control is surrendered. When control is surrendered, repetition becomes dangerous. And when danger is normalized, catastrophe follows. Operation Mincemeat worked because it was used once, under conditions of extreme necessity, by people who understood that success would not vindicate the method, only the moment. That restraint is what history rarely emphasizes. Operation Mincemeat did not win the war. It did not even decide the Mediterranean campaign on its own. What it did was more precise, and more disturbing. It proved that a modern military system can be redirected by a story it finds psychologically convenient, even when that story rests on fragile foundations. It proved that strategy does not always defeat an enemy by force, but sometimes by letting the enemy defeat their own priorities. And it proved that the most dangerous strategies are not the ones that fail loudly, but the ones that succeed quietly, and tempt repetition. This is why Operation Mincemeat still matters. Not because a corpse carried false papers, but because an entire command structure chose to believe what it was most afraid to be wrong about. In the end, the operation's true legacy is not deception. It is exposure. An exposure of how wars are shaped not just by firepower and planning, but by pressure, fear, and the invisible architecture of decision-making. And that architecture, unlike a battlefield, rarely leaves visible scars. You now understand why this was not just an unusual campaign. It was a reminder that in war, the most decisive moves often happen long before the first shot is fired.